Hello everyone and welcome back to the Small Church Big Vision series. My name is Sam Song from the Purpose Driven team and we are in week 2 of our series. Now we hope that the first session was helpful and insightful. So for some of us, I know that it may have been an opportunity to discover that we have drifted off course and that we need to make a course correction. And for some of you, it may have energized you and helped you to find the clarity and courage to step into the next season of ministry. Either way, we pray that you found it to be helpful and encouraging. So with that, let's grab our notebook and let's dive into session 2 with our friend Karl Vaters, where he's going to help us to think not like a big church.
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and I'm a small church pastor. I just want to welcome you today to this session. We're going to be talking about what it means actually to be a small church pastor and how to be okay in your skin where you can say that too without it feeling like you're admitting some kind of failure. So I'm actually asked regularly, why do I open my talks that way most of the time with, hi, I'm Karl and I'm a small church pastor. Well, let me walk you through a couple things. We really need to define some things. First of all, when we say small church, what do we mean? Because small is a relative term, right? So what do we mean when we say small church? Well, when I say small church, here's how I define it currently. And my definition has changed over the years, and it'll get better later, but here's what it is right now. Right now, the way I define it is this. There are 2 types of small churches. There's the church of 50, give or take 50. And there's the church of 150, give or take 50. Now, I know if you're in a church of 50, give or take 50, especially if you're on the smaller end of that, and you just heard me say that a church of 150, give or take 50, which means a church of 200 is considered small. And if you're in a congregation of 20, you're thinking, well, he has no idea where I'm coming from if he thinks 200 is still a small church. 200 may be bigger than the church in your entire town. I understand that. In fact, when you take a look demographically, the church of 20 is a far more common expression of the church than a church of 200. So why do we include it that way? Well, here's why. First of all, I know there are real big differences between a church of 50, give or take 50, and a church of 150, give or take 50. I know because I've spent a lot of time pastoring both of those size of churches, and there's a lot of differences. I acknowledge that. But the reason we include all of them under the phrase small church is because there's far more in common in the way we pastor at about 200 and at about 20 than there is in common between the way we pastor at 200 and let's say at about 500. And the reason for that is really simple. It's our memories. We are incapable of knowing everybody and remembering everybody once you get above 150 or 200 people or so. We are simply, we're topped out. Now, thankfully, we've got a God who knows all things, all people at all times and all places, so he can take care of everyone just fine, but I'm not him. So once a church grows to a certain size, we have to pastor differently. It simply changes really dramatically above what's sometimes called the 200 barrier, although that's not one of my favorite terms because barrier implies we have to bust through it, which, as we'll talk about in a bit, isn't absolutely necessary. So when we say small church, that's kind of what I mean. Secondly, when I say I'm a small church pastor, what do I mean by that? Well, in our ministry time together, my wife, Shelley, and I, we've pastored 3 different churches, lead pastor at 3 different churches. The first one was a tiny little chapel deep into the woods. In fact, it was so deep into the woods that if you pulled into the parking lot at noon on a sunny California day, your automatic headlights would go on. That's how deep into the woods it was. So tiny little church in a tiny town deep into the woods. And the Lord sent us there for about 4 years, and we had a good time there, but the Lord sent us there on purpose for a short time, even though we didn't know that it was for a short time. The next church that we pastored was in a suburban area, and we went there for an even shorter period of time, very unintentionally by everybody. It was less than 2 years, and it was really a very, very difficult season. And at the end of that season, we actually left with our tail between our legs and really doubting even our call to ministry. And then we showed up at a tiny little church in Orange County, California. And it had been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years, which means less than 2 years average per pastor. And if you add in 6 to 9 months between pastors, you've got an average of about 18 months per pastor for a decade. I actually told them when I showed up, I said, you really haven't been pastored in a decade. You've had a series of extended guest speakers is what's really been going on. They had almost voted to close the church. And they thought, let's see if the Lord's got something else for us. And they brought in one more pastor, and that was me. It was kind of like, this is our last shot. So we showed up, and we were hurting, and we showed up to a church that was hurting. But I looked around and I saw where we were. The church was then and still is today on a major street on Euclid Street in Orange County. If you go straight up 8 miles, you'll hit Disneyland. So there's a lot of people around. And at around that time, I looked in the neighborhood and I saw just within a few miles of our congregation were some of the big world-famous churches that I'd heard about. Less than a 5-minute drive from our church is the original Calvary Chapel. A little further away from that, Crystal Cathedral, the original Vineyard, Saddleback Church. It only took me 25 minutes to drive here today. Very close to us. Just over the border, Angelus Temple, where the Church of the Foursquare Gospel started. And not far from that, for those of you who come from a Pentecostal background, Azusa Street is less than a 45-minute drive from our front door of our church. So I looked around and thought, this isn't just a place where big things happen. This is a place where big movements begin. So let's see if the Lord will do that through us. And for the first few years, we actually showed up at a church that on a big Sunday had 30 people. On some Sundays only had about a dozen. It's a very, very small facility. Like even today, if you come to that church and if you want to sit in the back row, first of all, shame on you if you do, but if you come to our church and you want to sit in the back row, there's only going to be about 4 rows in front of you. It's still a very, very small facility. But I thought, we're in a big populated area. We're on a major street where tens of thousands of people drive by every day. We're in an area where big things happen, so we're going to move forward. And we started doing some things, and for a while, things actually got quite good. I remember actually, at about the 7-year point, we were running about 75 people. We'd started with, a dozen to 30, depending on the Sunday, but we were running about 75 people pretty steadily at about the 7-year point. And I remember I got out of the day from the church, and I sat down in my car in the parking lot. And I was looking out over the hood of the car through the windshield at the church building, and all of a sudden it hit me. That's a healthy church. I'm pastoring a healthy church. We'd been there 7 years, and I realized the church is now healthy. So I actually went to our church leadership, and I said, our church is healthy now. And they kind of had my reaction. They went, oh, wow, how did that happen? Because they hadn't been a healthy church in 20 years, and I hadn't pastored a healthy church in a decade. So we looked at each other and went, what do we do now? I felt like, sitting in that car, I felt like I'd been under the hood of the church trying to get it running for 10 years. It was finally running, and now I was sitting in the driver's seat, and I didn't know where to take it. So we sat down and we said, what do you do with a healthy church? Well, you try to bring that health to others. So we started reaching out to the community. We did some advertising campaigns. And fairly soon after that, we started outgrowing our building. We actually hit a point where we were running about 200 people on a Sunday morning at about the 15-year point after I'd been there for about 15 years. And we had to, we were jamming our tiny little building twice on a Sunday and overfilling our very small parking lot. And so we found a local junior high school, and we rented that big common room. I call it the CAFA Gymnatorium because it's where everything happens in a junior high school, right? And it was large for us. It held maybe 400 people. So we held 2 services there on a Sunday. And in the next 2 years in that facility on Sunday mornings, we grew from 200 to almost 400 people. And at that point, I actually went to our church leadership and I said, okay, we've gone from 200 to 400 in 2 years. And the next 2 years, we're likely to go to about 600. We need to actually hire a staff for 600 because that's where we're heading. They agreed, so we went out and hired staff for that. And then after a couple months of holding steady at 400, everything started going in reverse. In less than 2 years, we grew from 200 to 400. And then in less than a year, we collapsed down to, actually, I can't tell you how small we got because it's fun to count when you're growing. But when you're dropping that fast, it's like, don't give me the numbers anymore. I know everybody's name. The only good news was we didn't need to rent the junior high school anymore. We fit really easily inside our small building again. Suffice to say this, every Sunday we were under 100, and some Sundays we were under 50. And there had been no scandal, and there had been no split, and I didn't know what was going on or why. So I looked around and tried to figure it out. And I actually, at that season, felt so discouraged and so frustrated and quite frankly, so angry at myself, at the church, at God, that I actually walked away from the church for 40 days. And the only reason I left for 40 days instead of 80 is because I couldn't find an 80 in the Bible. I thought, if somebody somewhere has done it in the Bible, they'll let me do it, but it's all 40s. So I took a 40-day retreat because it was in the Bible and I figured they'd let me. And in that 40 days when I left, I didn't know if I would go back either to that church or back to ministry again. I found myself sitting in a counselor's office. A local church pastor actually who had become a Christian counselor. And I started pouring my heart out to him and my frustration and my discouragement and my anger. And at one point he looked at me and he said, Karl, you got to figure out how to redefine success. You're trying to chase numbers at the expense of health, and it's not just hurting the health of your church, it's hurting your health. And we started working on things, and we started turning things around. After 40 days, I came back to the church. I still wasn't fully healthy again, but I was at least facing in the right direction with some of the help that I'd received. And I remember about 6 months later, as I was meeting with our staff and volunteers, and I looked at them and I started talking about, we've got to get our numbers up again. And in the middle of saying that, I heard myself say it again. I heard those old feelings come back again. And I actually stopped in the middle of that conversation. I looked at our staff and volunteers and I said this sentence: we've got to stop thinking like a big church. Their jaws hit the floor. Mine might have as well, because the mantra of the church growth movement at that time in the 2000s was, if you want to be a big church, you've got to think like a big church. And so I said, we've got to stop thinking like a big church. And then I said, and we've got to stop it for one reason: because we're not a big church. If we become a big church, then we'll think like a big church. But in the meantime, we have to figure out, what does a healthy small church look like? Because that's what we are. And here's the weird thing: nobody in the room knew how to answer that question, including me. I've done the research since then to discover that like 95% of the churches in the world are considered small. And yet in that room, we didn't know the answer to, what does a healthy small church look like? So from that point, I started a relentless search to figure out, what does a healthy small church look like? We've got to stop thinking like a big church, because we're not one. We have to think like a healthy small church. But how did I end up in that spot? How did I end up in the spot almost leaving ministry, almost burning out, almost killing a healthy, good church? It's because I believe something that I have since come to call the grasshopper myth. My first book is entitled The Grasshopper Myth, and when you give a book that title, you got to explain yourself. So what is the grasshopper myth? Here's how I define it in my book. The grasshopper myth is this: it's the false impression that our small church ministry is less than what God says it is, because we compare ourselves with others. Now, what's the toxic word in that sentence? It's compare, isn't it? The problem is comparison. When we compare our ministry with somebody else's ministry, either we will be bigger than their ministry and will be filled with pride, or we'll be smaller with their ministry and will be filled with shame and guilt, and neither one of them is a healthy basis to launch good ministry from. We can't do the comparison anymore. Well, I get the name of grasshopper myth, though, from the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, if you're a church leader, you know the story. The 12 spies are sent into the land. They're told to come back with a report from the land that they're going into, and 10 of them come back with a negative report. And here's part of the report from the 10 who come back. In Numbers 13, beginning with verse 32, it says this: all the people we saw there are of great size. One translation says there are giants in the land. And then it says in verse 33, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. So pause and think about that verse. Where did they seem like a grasshopper first? In their own eyes. If you don't see a grasshopper in your mirror, no one else will see a grasshopper in you. They only look like grasshoppers to the giants because they saw a grasshopper in their own eyes first. Eleanor Roosevelt is credited with saying, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And that's what I did for almost 2 decades in ministry. I gave consent to the big churches and big ministries around me to make me feel inferior. They weren't doing that to me. I did that to myself. I saw a grasshopper in my own eyes, and then I looked around jealous of the giants around me. And that's no way to run healthy ministry. So that was when I realized I've got to stop thinking like a big church. I've got to stop striving to be something that I'm not. And I have to figure out, where has God placed me and why has He put me here and what does it look like to do healthy small church ministry? So I started doing the work. I started discovering a few principles about what a healthy small church looks like. Let me start by giving you what I like to call the 3 undeniable realities of church ministry. Here they are. First of all, reality number 1, 80 to 90% of churches will never be larger than 250 people. Now, how can I predict that? Well, because the best predictor of future events is past history, and for 2,000 years and counting, 80 to 90% of congregations have not been larger than 250 people. Most of the growth of the church for 2 millennia has gone forward on the multiplication of smaller venues far more often than on the building of larger venues. Larger venues are great, but that's not been the typical story of the church for 2,000 years. 80 to 90% of churches will never be larger than 250 people. So that reality leads to reality number 2, which is this: virtually all pastors will pastor a small church for at least some time in our ministry. If you are a lead pastor or you want to be a lead pastor, prepare to lead small. That will be in your future almost certainly. If you're thinking, no, I'm going to plant a church and it's going to become large. Well, when you plant it, it's going to be small the first week. Or maybe you'll have that big first week boom. The second week will guaranteed it'll be small. You're going to pastor a small church for at least some time in our ministry. So if virtually all of us are going to do it, shouldn't we figure out how to do it well? See, I don't want churches to be small. I just want small churches to be great. And there are a lot of small churches around us. So let's make sure they're great, because we're all going to pastor a small church for at least some time of our ministry. A lot of us are going to pastor a small church for most of our ministry. And there's a bunch of us that are going to pastor a small church for our entire ministry lives, which leads to reality number 3. And I want you to hear this really carefully. You can lead a small church well without settling for less. This is one of the big pushbacks whenever people hear about that I celebrate small churches and that I want to help resource small churches. A lot of the pushback I'll get will be, so it's fine to just settle for less and not reach the world for Jesus? No, never, not going to be it. No, of course not. As long as there's one person in your area, or even now on the internet, as long as there's one person in the world who doesn't know Jesus, we have to strive to reach out. We can never, ever settle for less. But it doesn't mean that our church is necessarily going to get larger. There may not be more people sitting in front of me on a Sunday morning, even in a healthy, strong, growing missional church. So I started asking myself, what if when Jesus said, I will build my church, what he had in mind was not a world only filled with mega churches and big cathedrals? What if when Jesus said, I will build my church, what he had in mind was a handful of really large churches, but a whole lot of small churches all across the globe, tucked into every corner, every neighborhood, every town, all over the world. In the last 40 years, a lot of us have made mega churches the standard. Big churches are great. Mega churches are awesome. I celebrate every single one of them. But they're not the standard. They're the outliers. Even with the growth of the mega church, the typical way the church grows is through smaller venues. You can lead a small church well without settling for less. Instead, what we do is something that I call IKEA envy. I came up with this idea a few years ago when an IKEA came in near our house. And I remember the first time Shelley asked me to go to IKEA. Husband and wife going to the store together, I knew what was going to happen, right? We drive in, and I'm telling you, IKEA makes the biggest stores on the face of the earth. I'm convinced the one near us, you can see it from space. It's ridiculously big, right? But I thought, I've been in big stores before. I've been in the mall before. I've gone to Bass Pro Shop. I know what to do in a big store. We're going to walk in. She's going to go her way and find her stuff. I'm going to go find something that doesn't bore me to death. When she's ready, she'll text me. We'll meet. I'll help her haul the stuff out to the car. Oh, no, not in an IKEA. You're not allowed to do that there. They've got literal arrows on the floor to take you through the rat maze until you get to the end. And what we often do in a small church is, it's like we're in a Starbucks-sized church. Can you imagine the chairman of Starbucks getting together with their executives and saying, you know what, in order to compete with IKEA, we've got to make our stores bigger? Would that make any sense for Starbucks at all? Of course not. You don't have to like IKEA or like Starbucks, but you have to acknowledge they've been really good at what they've done. IKEA makes really big furniture stores and puts them in only a few places. Starbucks makes really small coffee shops and puts them everywhere they can possibly find to squeeze them in. Small is part of the mission statement for Starbucks, and big is part of the way they do it in IKEA. But part of what we do in the church is this. Most of us are in Starbucks-sized churches, but we look at the IKEA-sized church next to us and go, we've got to do it that way. And that's like Starbucks looking at IKEA and going, we've got to follow the IKEA model. No, there are very few principles that are transferable between those sizes. But there's nothing wrong with Starbucks being small. In fact, it's a part of what makes them work. And when we take a look around the world and we ask ourselves, why are there so few big churches and so many small churches? The question I'm starting to ask now is, maybe the number of small churches isn't part of our failure. Maybe all of these small churches is part of God's strategy that he wants us to participate in. And if that's the case, then I want to know what God's strategy is, and I want to be a part of it. As I started looking around for this, I discovered something actually fairly recently in the last year or two. It's a business phenomenon called the long tail. And we'll put a chart up for you to show you about this. But what it basically does is I want you to imagine a chart. You've got a two axis this way and an axis that way. And it's the way YouTube works, it's the way Amazon works, it's the way Google works. But let's take YouTube as an example. On one side, you've got a spike. You've got the videos that go viral, right? Everybody wants a viral video. So there's this big spike over here on the side, but there's only a handful of them. So there's only a couple videos that will be in the billions. Immediately, as you get more videos, you start dropping, and there's a handful of videos in the millions. There's a whole bunch more in the thousands. And then you've got this thing called the long tail that stretches out a really, really long way on the chart. And what YouTube has discovered is this. There are as many people watching the smaller videos in the long tail as there are people watching the big videos in the big spike. It's half and half. And what YouTube has discovered is this. They cannot function as a business by only having viral videos, and they cannot function as a business by only having the small mom and pop videos. But when you add the big spike videos to the long tail videos, you've got a business that is almost unstoppable. And you know what? It's exactly the same in the church. The percentages are the same. There are a handful of really large churches in the world. They get the spotlight, they get the news, and they're doing great work for God. But there's only a few of them in the big spike. But the further you go down, there's a long tail of millions of congregations, small congregations scattered across the globe. And there are about 2 billion Christians in the world, according to the Pew Forum. And about half of them go to small churches, and half of them go to large churches. So you got to look at that and you got to go, okay, which part of the body of Christ are we going to do without? Well, YouTube has figured they need both, and the church needs to understand we need both too. The church needs to embrace its long tail. There's just as much great ministry being done by the small churches in the long tail of the church as there is great ministry being done by the handful of really large churches in that big spike. They both matter. So if you're in one of the smaller churches, don't look at it and go, I don't really account because we're not in a big church. No, you're a part of the church that's serving fully half the Christians in the world and doing fully half of the church and Christian ministry throughout the world. That long tail matters. But the long tail generally functions according to different leadership principles than the churches in the big spike. But we've got to, first of all, just make an adjustment in our thinking to understand how much the long tail matters, and then we've got to make sure that we embrace it and really do the resourcing and encouraging of those in small churches, which is really what this entire seminar is all about. Then from that, I discovered a handful of principles, and I want to work 3 of them out for you in a simple phrase. Small is not a problem, a virtue, or an excuse. Let me say it again. Small is not a problem, a virtue, or an excuse. Now I want to walk you through those 3 really important keywords. First of all, small is not a problem. Unfortunately, it's been presented that way. Why was it that for so many years, as our church was getting healthier and better, I started getting more and more frustrated? When I went to counseling, some of it was because the church had collapsed in numbers. But why did it collapse in numbers? We discovered a few things, and you know what one of them was? One of them was because I was pursuing numbers at the expense of health. And why did I do that? Because I believed that being small was a problem, that we had to get bigger, and that bigger itself would fix things. And it never does that. So we have to understand, first of all, small is not a problem. Jesus did not wake up this morning depressed by the size of your church. You may have, but he did not. He knows exactly where you are. He put you there. He knows exactly the people you do have and don't have, the facility you do have and don't have, the money you do have and don't have. And he's not upset by it. He's wanting to use it. Small is not a problem. Now, for all my theologically precise friends, Jesus has not had to wake up since he ascended into heaven 2,000 years ago. It's a figure of speech. I get it, but I always get that pushback. Right? When I talk about Jesus not waking up this morning depressed by the size of your church. This is where I came up with we have to stop thinking like a big church phrase. I had to realize small is not a problem. So first of all, small is not a problem. Secondly, small is not a virtue. Big churches are great. Small churches are great. Small churches are not better than big churches by virtue of them being small. And I've heard it too many times, and I'm so sick of it. I've actually heard small church pastors say this, the only reason our church is small is because we're the only church in our town preaching the true gospel. Every time I hear that, I don't know if I want to take a knee or what it is. It just depresses me every time. And every time I hear that, I look back and I think, you know what? Unless your church is literally the only church in your town, let's talk about your pride problem before you get up and preach on Sunday, because that's a bigger issue than the size of your church. Small is not a virtue. Small is not better than big. There's a really popular meme that goes around on Facebook all the time. Every once in a while, it'll pop up on my thread, and it's a picture on the top of a huge church packed to the gills, and over the top of it says, here's what happens when you preach what they want to hear. And then underneath of it, there's a small church with nobody in it, and it says, and here's what happens when you preach the truth. What a bunch of nonsense. When we do that, we deny the power of the gospel to draw people. Small is not a virtue. Small is not better than big. Small is not a problem. Small is not a virtue. It's not better than big. And finally, and maybe most importantly for some of us, small is not an excuse. Again, there are far too many churches out there, too many church leaders that I've talked to, far too many pastors that I've spent time with who are putting off till tomorrow what they should be doing today. And what they'll do is they'll say things like, well, when our church gets bigger, then we'll be able to have the outreach we plan. When the church gets bigger, then we'll be able to have a full band, and then we'll be able to bring people in, and then we'll be able to have young people. And it's all of this putting off until tomorrow. And all it is making excuses. Small is not an excuse for not doing the greatest possible ministry that you can do right now. There are no excuses. Celebrating and resources small churches is not excusing bad ministry. We can do great ministry at any size. You know how I know that? Because I've read through the New Testament. More than once, you might be happy to know. I've read through the New Testament. And as I read through the New Testament, here's what I discover. There's not a single command from Jesus to the New Testament church, or from Paul to the New Testament church, or from John to the New Testament church. Go through the whole list. There's not a single command to the New Testament church that cannot be done by 2 or 3 people who love Jesus, love each other, and share the gospel with other people. There's not a single command in the New Testament that you look at that you'd go, well, I could do that if only we had more money. Or we could do that if only we had a better building. Or we could do that if only we had more people. Not a single command in the New Testament that says any of that. But often we'll use it as an excuse. I wish I could, but I can't because my church is too small. Stop with the excuses. Take a look at how Jesus changed the world with just a handful of people. Take a look at the transformation that happened with people's lives. They didn't have a building. Jesus never wrote a book. There's very little talk about the finances. When they did, it was like throw out a net and get some money out of the mouth of a fish. God will always provide. If we are on mission with Him, the size of our church is no restriction to doing today what Jesus calls your church to do today. We've got to stop offering excuses. But I did that for years. I'll admit it. I offered excuses. When we get bigger, then we'll be able to. And so I found myself in this position that I talked about at the beginning, where I walked away from ministry for a season and almost walked away from ministry permanently. And I wish I could tell you that during the 40 days sabbatical that I took, I wish I could tell you that during that 40 days, I spent the entire time in prayer and fasting, but I can't lie to you. That's not what I did during those 40 days. In fact, I actually went to a couple friends and I said, you know what? I'm too mad at God to talk to Him right now. So if you will take my prayer burden for me, I'll appreciate it. And they did that for me, and I will be grateful to them forever. And then sadly, I went home and I watched TV and I ate too much ice cream. Now, I'm not giving you that as a prescription for health. If your church isn't going well and you're not doing well, Karl Vaters is not telling you today to go home and watch too much TV and eat too much ice cream. That is what I did. It's closer to a confession of sin than a solution, but that's what I did because I want to be honest with you. So I'm sitting down and I'm just feeling bad for myself, and I'm watching TV. And I thought, if I'm gonna watch stupid TV, there's nothing more stupid to watch than reality TV. I know, because we live where we make them. In fact, I'm married to a real housewife of Orange County. So anyway, I was watching stupid TV shows because there's nothing more stupid than watching reality TV. But I discovered that there were two reality TV shows that I really like to watch, and they were the restaurant makeover shows. And it was always a British guy coming into an American restaurant to tell Americans how to make their restaurants better. I don't know what is it about us as Americans. We can hear the most ridiculous insults, but if it comes with a British accent, we think it's wonderful. It's weird because we fought an entire war to not have to listen to people with British accents, but somehow we just really like taking orders from them. Anyway, I would watch these shows, and they'd go into restaurant after restaurant after restaurant, and there was a pattern to these shows. They all have a template by which they run the shows. And I started noticing certain things repeating. Quite often, they'd walk into a restaurant and go, I drove by 3 times because I couldn't see your sign. Or they'd walk in and go, wow, what's that smell? When was the last time somebody cleaned the carpet in here? Or they'd find a ridiculously huge menu and they'd say, we got to narrow that down to a single page of one type of thing that you can do well. And those patterns repeated themselves. But there was one thing that they never ever did. Not one of these restaurant makeover people ever walked into a failing restaurant, looked around the failing restaurant and went, you know what the problem with this restaurant is? It's not big enough. You got to make it bigger. Never once. You know why? Because even these restaurant people on a fake reality TV show understand something that we in the church have got to figure out, and it's this. 3 simple words. Bigger fixes nothing. Bigger fixes nothing. We've got this thing in our heads, and I know because I had it in my head for too many years, that the reason our church has got problems is because we don't have enough people. And if only we'd get more people, then we'd have fewer problems in our church. Really? More people would equal fewer problems? If that's what you think, I have a question for you. Have you met people? It's the only person I know who thinks more people equals fewer problems. They've never met one. Because never in the history of the world has more people equaled fewer problems. Different problems, but never fewer. But we've got that thing in our head. If only my church would get bigger, then I'd have fewer problems. Bigger is going to fix everything. Bigger fixes nothing. If you take an unhealthy small church and all you do is make it bigger, then you've got an unhealthy big church. And that's not better, that's worse. But if you take an unhealthy small church and you make it healthy, even if it doesn't get bigger, healthy is always better. This is the deal. You can't lose with healthy. If you're striving for numerical growth, we've all seen the sad results for decades now of ministries that got large only to flame out because it wasn't built on a solid foundation of health. So you can get bigger and have it be really bad. But if you start with health, if you continue with health, if you have the goal of health, sometimes that will bring numerical increase. In fact, I'm going to say most of the time that will bring at least some numerical increase. But even if you end up at a point where you stay at a particular numerical place, as long as your church continues to be healthy, continues to be missional, continues to be outward reaching. I know a lot of wonderful, awesome, healthy churches all around the world that are doing great kingdom expanding work, and they're going to do it at that size for a long period of time. Why? Because for whatever reason, the combination of leadership skills and gifts of the pastor, along with the gifts of the people in the congregation, along with the community that they're around, along with the calling that they're given, all of that combines to say, from the Lord, you're going to be working at this size because this is your optimum size to do the best possible kingdom work. And I've seen it happen so many times. So, do we want the kingdom of God to expand? Yes. If that means my church will get bigger, then I will accept that. But if that means I'm going to do the best kingdom expanding work at a small size, then we have to learn to accept that as well. It's challenging. It's difficult. I'm the small church guy, and there are still Sundays I look around and go, where is everybody this week? I get those feelings. We will never overcome them completely. But we have to get to the point where we understand that bigger fixes nothing. It's not about health so that we can get bigger. It's health so that we can be more effective and have greater kingdom impact. Let me ask you this question. If the best possible impact that you and your church could have in the kingdom of God at home and around the world was at the size you are right now, could you accept that? That's a serious question for all of us. I had to wrestle with that question for years myself. And it wasn't easy for me to get to the point where now today, with confidence, I can say, yes, I accept that with joy. In fact, at times I look around when I'm on a larger campus and I go, man, I am glad I do not have to deal with all of this because I have no idea how. I'm not built for it. In fact, often I get questions about that collapse that I described earlier, right? We went from 200 to 400 in 2 years. Then we went from 400 to well under 100 and even under 50 on some Sundays in less than a year with no scandal and with no split. What happened? Well, there were a couple things that happened, but one of the primary ones was this. I made the shift when we went over 200. I made the shift in my leadership styles that you absolutely have to make when you get bigger. I moved from being a shepherd to being a rancher. I went from being a pastor to being a manager. And you have to make that shift. You have to give the pastoral duties to other people in the congregation as the church gets that large. I did that willingly, and then I was miserable. Now, I didn't know when I was miserable because how can a pastor be miserable when the church is doubling in 2 years? But I was miserable. You know why? Because when I made the shift from shepherding pastor to managing rancher, overseeing staff and overseeing budgets and overseeing, trying to raise money for the next building, I was operating outside of my primary gifting and calling. I was operating outside of the things that fill my spirit, that fill my soul, that replenish me, and I was doing things almost during the entire week. Almost all of my ministry hours were spent doing things that needed to be done, but that I'm not called to do, and then instead of filling my soul, they sucked my soul dry. And because of that, I was becoming miserable. And that's a big part of the reason people started leaving, because you don't want to be around a church when the pastor's miserable. Even if you can't quite put your finger on what's wrong, people knew something was wrong even when I didn't know something was wrong. We got bigger, and it didn't fix anything. So we had to figure out where does God want us and how do we become healthy? And then what do we do with that? So that's what we're going to be looking at as we continue on through this series. The next time I talk to you, I want to give you a little bit of a lead about where that's going to go before I conclude with one last point. And that's this. Next time I talk, we're going to talk about 3 ways that your church can be most effective at its current size. And part of what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a Venn diagram that I created that shows you the overlap between big churches on one side and small churches on the other side. And we're going to talk about how we share some things, but that there are an awful lot of things that come from a big church perspective that simply aren't in our circle. And by the time we're done with that, you'll actually have a filter where you're going to be able to hear not just from fellow small church pastors, but you'll be able to hear from other big church pastors, and you'll know how to filter and adapt things that will fit your context without just simply accepting it. We're going to talk about the IKEA and the Starbucks difference and where the overlap is and where the overlap is not, so that we can get better benefit out of the resources that we receive from churches of all sizes. And a part of the section in my next talk is one of my favorite things. It's what I call the "Why is my church so weird?" section of my talk. So if you're pastoring a small church, I got news for you. Your church is weird. Your church is different. Your church is unique. And here's the rule. The smaller your church is, the weirder it is. That's just the way it is with people. We're going to talk about why that's the case. We're going to talk about how to lean into it rather than away from it, and how to actually utilize the unique, the strange, and we'll use the word again, weird part of your church for the glory of God. But before we get to that next time, let me conclude with this one for the next few minutes as we have just a couple minutes together. A lot of you watching today are very discouraged. I know that because I have never yet met with a group of ministers of more than 3 of us where there's not some of us who are discouraged around that circle. I know that because I get it. I've told you just a portion of my story and where some of my discouragement came from. And I wanted to tell you that because, first of all, I wanted you to know that I understand discouragement in the pastorate, but I also wanted to let you know that there's hope out of that discouragement. So let me conclude by these 2 short little statements together. First of all, pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. For years, I treated it that way. Again, part of the reason I open my talks with, "Hi, I'm Karl and I'm a small church pastor," is because when I finally was able to admit that to myself, it was like a burden lifted. I had pastored small churches for all my ministry, and if anybody ever said I was a small church pastor, I would have wanted to punch him in the nose. But why? It's not an insult. But I did that. I looked around at a small congregation that wasn't getting bigger at the pace that people said it should get bigger at, and I kept asking myself, God, what am I doing wrong? When I left for that season and went to that counseling, it was, God, what am I doing wrong? And the answer that came back was, you may not be doing anything wrong. You may be exactly where God placed you, and the size of your church right now and the placement of your church right now and the people who are in your church right now, God knows every single one of those aspects, and he wants to use that for his glory. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. Then what is it? Here's what it is. It's a specialty, and it's worth doing well. Yes, pastoring a small church is a specialty. I know that because I've talked to some big church pastors, and they've told me, Karl, I could not pastor your church. They would drive me crazy. And you know what? They're not wrong. If everybody could pastor a small church, then everybody would do it. But no, it's not for everybody. It turns out it may be for most pastors. That may be where God calls most of us to be. Now, is it possible? Are there some churches, small churches that shouldn't be small, but they're doing the wrong principles, they're using the wrong resources, they're looking at things the wrong way? Absolutely. Not every small church is healthy, but not every small church is broken either. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. It's a specialty, and it's worth doing well. And that's what this series is all about. We are not here to help you grow massively to the next level. If that happens as a result of getting healthy, great. We will thank God for it and we will celebrate that along with you. But that's not the point. The point is, first of all, to understand that I'm not being punished by God because the church isn't getting bigger. It isn't necessarily that I'm doing something wrong. When our church wouldn't grow for a while, because of where I live, I've got church growth specialists all around us. I brought over a dozen of them in as secret shoppers on Sunday mornings to say, what are we doing wrong? And the first person who came in after the service came to me and sat down with me and said, basically, this church isn't going to stay small for long. You're doing so many things right. I got a few tweaks for you, but this is a great church. It's healthy, it's strong. It won't be small for long. And the first time you hear your small church won't be small for long, it feels great. The 10th time, not so much. Every one of them had the same thing. It's inevitable you'll get bigger because your church is healthy, was what we were told. It turns out it wasn't the case. Because here's how it works. Whenever a scientist comes up with a theory, they have to test the theory. The theory makes sense. If I'm a strong missional church, if we're actually reaching out to people, then there will be more people in our church and the church will get bigger. That theory makes sense, doesn't it? It does. The problem is when you actually take a look at the churches around the world that are doing that and test them, you find out that they don't necessarily get larger as a result of getting healthier and more missional and even more outward reaching. So when you test it, things change. But it does mean that we can impact the kingdom of God. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. It's a specialty and it's worth doing well. And that's what we want to help you with. Thanks for being with us today.
Hey friends, welcome back. And so we're here with Karl and Dale again. And so Karl, so we're a little weird, huh?
Well, yeah. Next time we talk, we're going to talk about that a little bit. And yeah, the weirdness comes out, especially in a smaller congregation. But yeah, you're going to have to wait to hear the rest of that one. Yeah.
Well, hang tight for that one. So let's talk about this passage. So why did you think that this was important for pastors to hear?
For a lot of years, when I wrote my first book, I had the whole thing written and I hadn't written my story out. And I just did it for my own exercise of it. And I thought, who wants to hear my story? I'm an average pastor in an average church. My story isn't unique. It's not horrible enough to get anybody excited. It's not awesome enough to get anybody thrilled. And then as I wrote it out and had others read it, they were like, no, that's the glue that holds it together. That tells us you get where we're coming from, because the more specific your story is, the more universal it actually becomes. Because it turns out my average pastor story is a very typical pastor story. And so knowing that we're in this together, when I say we're in this together, when you read my story, people go, oh, we really are. He's not just saying it, his story proves it. Yeah. So that was a big part of it to me, was there's a whole lot of folks who have gone through these kinds of frustrations and challenges.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned comparison as one of the big challenges for not even just the small church pastors, but just all of us. Can you expand on that a little bit of just how we deal with it, how we could overcome it? What are some kind of mechanisms that we could put in our lives to kind of avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, everybody does it, right? When we were children, I remember for our grandkids, I remember when each of them came into the mimic phase, where whatever you did, they would follow it. So, she's pretending to pour tea because she saw grandma pour tea, right? And some of us never grow out of the mimic phase, right? Where all we're doing is we're duplicating the rhythms of things that we saw before and then comparing our results with those we're mimicking, and the results never work out correctly. Comparison is always death to good ministry, because your church is different from every other church. Yeah, it has some similarities. We'll talk about that in our next session, but there's a big part of every church that is simply different from every other church, and you've got to follow God's call on your life and on your church rather than trying to mimic and compare yourself to other churches. That's death.
Let me share with you too, Sam. I want to be really honest with our viewers. Often in comparison, I wasn't just comparing myself to other churches and going, wow, they're doing great. I was comparing myself to other people going, that guy's a terrible leader. Why is God blessing him? Why is God blessing her? It's like, comparison is certainly a crippling thing, but oftentimes what I later discovered is I had a lot of judgment in my heart, and it came from my insecurity because my church wasn't growing to the point it needed to, especially after we went through the church split that we went through. But I remember I would just look and go, I know Karl. I've been around him. Why is God blessing him and not blessing me? I don't get it. Right. And there were some guys that were terrible communicators. There were some pastors that I would look at and I'm going, that guy's not godly. I played golf with him. I know. But it's not about them. It's about what's in my own heart. And I think for a lot of us, maybe we need to do some examination of what's in our own heart, because we can't get clear understanding of what God wants us to do because our hearts aren't pure.
Yeah. One of the things that I also noticed, I've worked with pastors, especially the younger pastors, is that they compare themselves to others, but they also compare themselves to who they think they should be. And I found that to be even more draining and more taxing to them, because they're like, I should be this, I should be there by now. I mean, do you want to speak a little bit to that?
I wrote a book called that.
Yeah.
I wrote a book called Stalled, Hoping Out for Pastors Who Thought They'd Be There by Now. And the problem was, Sam, I couldn't define where there was. It's like I have this thing going on inside of me where I want to get to this thing. And recently I had an experience where it led me to sit down with a counselor. And as I'm talking with my counselor, I made this comment, and he really dove into this. I said, I cannot seem to ever become the image of who I think a great leader is. I can't ever become the guy that I think I'm supposed to become. And so he began to really dive into what's going on inside of you that causes that. And honestly, it was insecurity.
Yeah. As part of the counseling that I didn't tell in the main part of the story, at one point he said, Karl, you have to figure out how to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And I looked at him and said, I don't even know what that means.
Don't know how to do that.
And he said, I'm not sure what it means either, but that's what we have to figure out together, because the numbers are causing you to compare, and the comparison is killing you. Now, that doesn't mean we don't ever count numbers. Yeah, we count the offering, we count the attendance, we count percentage of people in different groups. There's wonderful information that numbers can give us, but it doesn't define us. And I was allowing the numbers not just to give me information, but to define me, my church, and the validity of what God was doing. And every time I did that, either I ended up proud or ashamed, and those aren't places that we can minister in a healthy way from. So I had to redefine success in ministry without numbers, but have the numbers give me information and not define it.
What really helped me was a friend of mine said that the goal in ministry is to do ministry from Jesus and not for Jesus. That changed everything for me, where I began to understand, hey, he just wants to work through me. And the only way he can work through me effectively is if I am allowing our relationship to grow daily. And you say, what do you mean allowing? Hey, you control a lot of where your relationship with the Lord is by just choosing to spend time with him or not. When you get so busy, you don't have time to pray. When you get so busy, you don't have time to spend just time listening to him. You'll get to a place to where you're more numbers or metrics oriented instead of just ministry oriented. And I think we've got to get back to that in our churches.
Yeah. And you're encouraging us to not think like a big church, in a sense, helping us to rethink What are some kind of practical ways for those who kind of need some help in knowing how to rethink a bit?
Yeah.
What are some things that you could advise our folks?
What Dale said is huge. A ministry from Jesus, not for Jesus. I had to learn that in our congregation about our facility. We have a ridiculously small facility for where we are. Mm-hmm. And I got to a point a few years ago where I realized if we're going to do only ministry in the facility, our no facility. We're here on Saddleback's campus. This is like a city, right? This campus is not big enough to hold all the ministry that God called Saddleback to do. Right. So our tiny little facility sure isn't big enough to do that. So we had to shift from doing ministry in the building to doing ministry from the building. And that changed our perspective. And then all of a sudden, if I'm doing ministry like we help a very close to where we're sitting right now. There's a women's crisis shelter where women and children who have gone through abuse in the home, they show up and they help them out. And we help them on a regular basis. We are not even allowed to give out the address because we're trying to protect them. Mm-hmm. And we were told from the very beginning when we started helping them that you cannot even invite them to your church because a guy in a van showing up to pick them up triggers women who are coming out of abuse situations. And so we said, you know what? There's something in the Bible about widows and orphans, and it doesn't say help widows and orphans only if you can invite them to your church. It just says help widows and orphans. So we realized we're just going to do that because we're ministering from the church, not just in the church. And it helped us to understand a little bit better it helps us recenter on what our purposes are. What are we really here to do? One of the great things that pastors say regularly, Pastor Rick says it all the time, is that we need to judge our church by our sending capacity and not our seating capacity. That is really where it has to flow from.
Sam, in the church that I pastored, when I first went there, we were in a very small building in a really bad location, and eventually relocated to a much larger building. But it was an old furniture store, and I didn't understand the cost of chairs. I thought, we need a couple hundred chairs. That's a lot of money. So we ended up buying Sam's Club chairs, okay? And those were still $20-something a piece. But before we got the chairs, we had a church up from Boston that had an older church that had remodeled and torn down the old building. We got their rounded pews and had them on a concrete floor. So if you sat on one end, there was a divider in the middle, and they would rock. And so you have this concrete. And we had this one specific chair, pew that if someone sat on that end, this end over here would fall off. Oh, wow. And so my dad sat on it one Sunday while I'm preaching, and it just it makes all this noise. And so the facility was embarrassing. We didn't have a lot of cash to update it and renovate it. So I was embarrassed about it. We had this couple that started coming, and actually Stephanie's on our team now. But they started coming, and they were a very sharp couple, and they were very blessed, and they started giving and tithing. And after a few weeks, I took them to dinner, and I said, you got to tell me, why are you here? Why are you coming to our church? It's obviously not very sharp. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. She says, I understand, or he said, we see your vision. Mm-hmm. They saw what we were trying to accomplish. And so there's so much more in a ministry than having the right facilities or all that. They need to see the heart behind why you do what you do.
Yeah. Well, you talked about IKEA and Starbucks, and in ongoing conversation, we even talked about maybe not Starbucks, maybe the local coffee shop. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I use IKEA and Starbucks because they're international brands, so it identifies really quickly. But for most small churches, it's Starbucks size, but it really isn't Starbucks feel. It's more like the local coffee shop. That is going to be different in one town than another. It doesn't just simply stamp it and repeat it like Starbucks does. So, and in fact, that's also a new generation thing. For the newer generation, they want to see something that really does come from the context, that comes from the soil, that comes from the place that they're actually meeting in, more like the local coffee house where they're serving artisan breads and that kind of a thing, rather than the thing that they're going to get exactly the same everywhere. Now, there's a comfort level to getting exactly the same thing everywhere. When Shelley and I travel, we've got Starbucks on our phone. It's easier to buy. We know we're going to get certain quality. But then when we get to a certain region and somebody asks us, where do you want to eat? It's never the chain. It's what's the regional thing that's going to give us a flavor of this place. And that's what a really healthy local church does particularly well, is it gives you it understands the culture around them, and it gives you a flavor of the culture around them. So better than Starbucks would be the local coffee shop for most small churches.
Yeah, it seems like authenticity is a really important thing for us as leaders, because that seems to be a very important aspect that the younger generation look towards, but it may also be in the facilities and how you express kind of the church experience to be true to the context that it's in. I think that also is sometimes been a barrier for some of the younger folks to join because they show up and it doesn't reflect the community at all. Yeah. And so it just almost looks like it's a franchise that just popped in. And so those are some things that we're learning to help our small pastors saying, hey, what's in your hand, right? Kind of like Apollo 13, right? What's in your hand? And how can you use this and express it in a way that is true and authentic to the people that you're trying to reach and in the community?
Sam, you're not going to be able to create an authentic church if you're not being authentic.
Exactly.
You know, everything rises and falls on leadership. And the truth of the matter is this, is if you're not willing to be authentic, if you're not willing to be honest, and look, one of the great things I love about this guy is he's willing to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because that's real life, that's real ministry. And if you want to have a church that's going to impact the community, you have to have this authenticity. I don't mean you have to get up and share all your dirty laundry, but you do have to be authentic to let people know, hey, I've struggled, I've been through difficulties. I know when Jamie and I went to, began to go to this different church in college, it was always, everything was so positive. And I hadn't been in part of a church that had vision or that talked about mission or was positive. But then I began to recognize over the years, our pastor would never talk about ever dealing with any issues at all. And I'm going, no one's life's that good. Yeah. You know, you got to be able to communicate and have balance there, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, we're looking around and we're seeing the sad results of a lack of transparency and authenticity in far too many places, from the church to politics to business to wherever. And it always has a price to pay. First of all, starting in the leader's soul. If you are living with projecting this ideal and living this ideal, that gap will kill you.
It will.
Even if nobody in the church discovers it, it will kill you. It will eat you alive. And until you make the intentional work to bring those closer together, not by lowering your standards, but by raising your behavior.
Yes.
Right?
That's a whole other talk.
Exactly, right? But until you close that gap, until you close it intentionally, it will in fact get wider, because you're constantly going to be presenting an even more false front to cover for your failures. And it might begin with small things where I'm just not as good as that person, so I'm going to pretend I am, and then it becomes something that eats away at you and usually ends up becoming a sinful thing. It may simply start as wanting to present a better front, fake it till you make it, and then it becomes something really toxic and really dangerous if you don't deal with it.
Yes. Well, thank you for, again, your incredible teaching today, and it's been fun to spend these weeks with you and kind of going deeper into the content. And so just to close us out, I think, again, we want to equip you, we want to train you, but we also want to encourage you. So I'm going to actually ask Karl to pray for our pastors, probably in the area of comparison. I think that's something that I'm hearing over and over again, to remind them of who they are, right? And so if you could close us out on that, we'll go there. Yeah.
All right, let's do that. Heavenly Father, thank you for every pastor and church leader represented here today. And Lord, I pray that you would help them to rest in you, to find their identity in you and not in comparing themselves to their own standards or to the standards of somebody else, but to know they are loved completely and totally. They are gifted completely for the task you've called them to do, and that you will be with them. They can work from you and not just for you. Release that burden from their shoulders. You said your burden would be easy, that it would be light, that we would be able to bear it. It's not without burden, it's not without challenge, but you're the one who carries it with us. And we thank you for that, Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, I'm going to encourage you not to miss next week where we talk about how church is weird, right?
Yeah.
So until then, take care and God bless.